One evening, Emily returned home from work, hoping to unwind and enjoy a quiet dinner with her husband, Mike. But as they sat down to eat, Mike dropped a piece of news that turned her night upside down. "My mom is moving in with us," he said casually, as if he were announcing a routine grocery run. Emily nearly choked on her drink, staring at him in disbelief. "Wait, what do you mean she's moving in?" Mike's calm demeanor barely wavered. "Yeah, she sold her house to help us pay off our mortgage. Since she doesn't have a place of her own anymore, she'll be living with us. It's for the best, really." Emily's shock quickly turned to frustration. "And when, exactly, was I going to be part of this decision? You didn't think I should have a say?" Mike shrugged, brushing off her concern. "I didn't think you'd mind. We talked about how great it'd be to have more financial freedom, right? Well, now we have it." For Emily, it was more than the invasion of privacy. She respected Mike's mother, Alice, but they had always maintained a polite distance. Living together was an entirely different story. Emily knew that, over time, close quarters with her mother-in-law would change their relationship. She was stunned by Mike's assumption that she'd be fine with such a massive change, especially since they had both agreed they could handle the mortgage on their own. "What about us?" Emily asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This is our home, Mike. And now we're supposed to just add someone else into our lives without discussing it." "Think about the positives, Emily," Mike replied, clearly trying to justify his decision. "We'll be financially secure. Mom's doing this for us." But Emily couldn't shake her doubts. She felt blindsided, like she was the last person whose opinion mattered in her own home. She had spent years working alongside Mike to make a life together, and now it seemed her voice didn't count when it mattered most. Adding insult to injury, Mike seemed almost smug, convinced that she would eventually come around to his way of thinking. Then, Mike casually added, "Oh, and my sister, Molly, is coming too. She's going through a rough patch after her divorce, so she'll stay with us until she gets back on her feet. It's just temporary, of course." At this revelation, Emily felt her patience snap. It was one thing to accommodate his mother, but his sister as well? Molly had always been a bit of a free spirit, constantly in search of a new adventure, but never quite managing to keep her life in order. Emily could only imagine the chaos that Molly would bring into their home, and she knew that temporary could mean months, even years, given Molly's track record. But Emily knew there was no going back now. Alice had sold her house, and Molly was en route with her bags packed. She realized that, like it or not, she would have to adjust to a drastically different life. Alice and Molly moved in, and from the very first day, Emily felt like an outsider in her own home. Alice quickly took charge, rearranging the kitchen and insisting on new house rules. Every day brought a new directive, a different meal schedule, better ways to clean, and even opinions on how to decorate. Emily's efforts to maintain her own routines were met with gentle but constant resistance as Alice implemented her vision of a well-run household. Molly was another story altogether. She hadn't settled into a job since her divorce, and rather than looking for work, she spent her time lounging around the house. While Emily juggled work and the daily responsibilities of the household, Molly seemed to regard their home as a refuge to unwind and relax, at Emily's expense. One morning, as Emily prepared breakfast, Alice entered the kitchen and gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Emily, I noticed you use quite a bit of salt in your cooking. It's really not good for the heart, you know. We'll try to keep things healthier while I'm here." Emily felt a pang of irritation but kept her response calm. "Thanks for the suggestion, Alice, but I like how I cook." Alice nodded, but the next day, Emily found that Alice had stocked the fridge with her own selection of low-sodium foods, replacing much of what Emily had bought. It was as though her preferences had no place in her own home. Later that evening, Emily mentioned the incident to Mike, hoping he'd help set some boundaries. "Mike, I need you to understand how difficult this is for me," she said carefully. "Your mom is changing everything around here. I feel like I don't have a say in my own home." But Mike brushed it off. "Come on, Emily. She's only trying to help. Just let her do things her way for a while. It's not worth the argument. Emily's frustration grew. Mike, this is my space too. It's supposed to be our space. I just want a little respect for how we've been doing things. But Mike merely shrugged, distracted and unconcerned. Emily's heart sank. It was clear he didn't see the disruption the way she did, or perhaps he simply didn't care enough to intervene. The situation with Molly was no better. Molly would often take over the living room, binge-watching television and leaving dishes on the coffee table. She made a habit of sleeping in and skipping household chores entirely. When Emily asked for help tidying up, Molly offered only a vague promise to get to it later, which rarely materialized. The imbalance weighed on Emily, but she felt trapped, unwilling to escalate the situation further. She clung to the hope that with time, Alice and Molly might settle and without undermining her role in the home. Yet, as the weeks passed, it became evident that this wasn't just a temporary adjustment, it was the start of a new dynamic that left Emily outnumbered in her own household. She sensed that this arrangement was not only testing her patience, but also revealing Mike's indifference to her needs. The home that she had worked so hard to build with Mike was slipping away, transformed into a place where she had little control. Each day, Emily felt her resolve weakening, wondering how long she could endure a life where her voice went unheard. As the weeks went by, Emily found herself increasingly sidelined in her own home. Alice had fully taken over the kitchen, going so far as to purchase her own set of dishes, cookware, and even small appliances that Emily hadn't agreed to. Alice justified each change with cheerful dismissiveness, insisting it was for the good of the family. Molly's behavior, meanwhile, continued to wear down Emily's patience. Molly had made no effort to find a job and had even taken over a spare bedroom as her personal studio. She filled the room with her art supplies and thrifted furniture projects that she never quite finished. Every surface was covered in paints, tools, and half-done crafts, turning what used to be a guest room into a cluttered workshop. One evening, after a long day at work, Emily returned home to find that Alice had rearranged the living room. The furniture, decorations, and even the placement of family photos had all been altered to suit Alice's style. Her carefully chosen decor, a reflection of her and Mike's life together, was now mixed in with Alice's own tastes, as though Emily's choices didn't matter. Feeling her frustration boil over, Emily called Mike into the room. "Mike, look at this," she said, gesturing to the rearranged space. "This isn't our living room anymore. Your mom's completely taken over." Mike, sensing her frustration, sighed. "Emily, it's just furniture. She probably thought she was helping." "That's the problem, Mike. I'm tired of being told what's helpful in my own home. I don't feel like I have a say in anything anymore. And don't even get me started on Molly's mess in the guest room." Mike shrugged, clearly unwilling to confront his mother or sister. "It's temporary. Molly will get her life together, and Mom just needs time to adjust. Can't you let this go for now?" Emily stared at him, disbelief giving way to resentment. "You keep saying it's temporary, but it's been weeks, and nothing has changed. They're not making an effort to respect our space, and you're just letting it happen." But Mike brushed off her concerns once again, telling her she was overreacting. For him, the added presence of his family seemed comfortable, even comforting. He saw no harm in them staying as long as they wanted and didn't share Emily's feeling of encroachment. Feeling defeated, Emily decided to stop asking Mike to intervene. Instead, she quietly began adjusting her own schedule to minimize interactions with Alice and Molly. She started leaving for work earlier and staying out later, taking on additional projects just to avoid coming home to the chaos and feeling of alienation. The household had become a place of subtle conflict, divided into silent factions. Alice and Molly continued living as they pleased, secure in the knowledge that Mike supported them. Meanwhile, Emily drifted further from the life she had built, struggling to hold on to any semblance of normalcy. Each night, as she lay awake, Emily found herself questioning how much longer she could endure this existence. Her sense of belonging, once so secure, now felt like a distant memory. And as the divide between her and Mike grew wider, she began to wonder if her marriage could survive the strain that his family had brought into their lives. As the days turned into months, the tension in the house became almost unbearable for Emily. She felt like a visitor in her own home, constantly trying to adapt to new routines dictated by Alice and Molly. Any attempt at compromise seemed futile. Alice had claimed the kitchen, and Molly's temporary art studio had taken permanent hold of the guest room, with her projects spilling into other parts of the house. Emily's patience finally snapped one Saturday morning when she discovered that Alice had gone through her closet, rearranging and organizing her clothes without permission. Alice greeted her with a bright smile, completely unaware of the boundaries she'd crossed. "I thought I'd help you sort through your wardrobe. You'd be amazed at how much space I freed up." Emily felt a surge of frustration. "Alice, that's my closet. I don't need help organizing my things." Alice's smile faded slightly, replaced with a look of mild disapproval. "I was only trying to help, Emily. Sometimes a little change is good." It was a small comment, but it stung. It felt as though Alice saw herself as the real authority in the house, reducing Emily's role to that of a tenant, or worse, a child. Emily tried to discuss this over dinner with Mike that evening, hoping he'd finally understand the boundaries that had been crossed. "Mike, I need you to see how this is affecting me," Emily said, her tone a mixture of frustration and hurt. "Your mom and Molly have taken over every part of our home, and now she's even going through my personal things. I can't keep living like this." Mike sighed, brushing off her concerns with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Emily, you're making this a bigger deal than it is. My mom's just trying to be helpful. It's just her way." "Her way?" Emily echoed, incredulous. "Mike, this is supposed to be our way. Our home. Your mom and sister don't respect our space, and you're letting them treat me like an outsider." Mike shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "They've done so much for us. I can't just tell them to leave." Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not asking you to tell them to leave, Mike. I'm asking you to set boundaries. To make them understand that they're guests here, and that this is our life, not theirs." But Mike remained unmoved, defending his family instead. "You're overthinking this, Emily. They're family, they're here to stay for as long as they need to." Realizing that Mike wouldn't support her, Emily felt the last remnants of her patience evaporate. She had tried to compromise, had asked for his help countless times, but it was clear he had chosen his loyalty to his family over their marriage. She went to bed that night feeling defeated, a heavy sense of isolation settling over her as she realized that the home she'd once loved had become a place of constant tension and discomfort. In the days that followed, Emily withdrew even further, focusing on her work and spending as little time at home as possible. She stopped trying to talk to Mike about setting boundaries, knowing that her words would fall on deaf ears. With each passing day, she felt herself drifting further from him, their connection overshadowed by the unspoken choice he'd made to side with his mother and sister. The more she withdrew, the more she realized that this wasn't the life she'd signed up for. Emily's dreams of a peaceful, loving home had been shattered, replaced by a reality where her own needs were ignored. For the first time, she began to consider what her life might look like outside of this marriage, away from a household where her voice went unheard. And as she looked around at the house that had once felt like a sanctuary, Emily knew that unless something changed, she would eventually reach a breaking point. The breaking point came one evening when Emily returned home late from work, exhausted and hoping for a quiet night. She walked into the kitchen and found Molly sprawled out on the couch, leaving dirty dishes scattered on the counter and an empty pizza box on the table. The house felt chaotic and completely out of control, a far cry from the home she'd once carefully built with Mike. As Emily cleaned up the mess in silence, Alice entered the room, observing her with a critical eye. "Emily," she began in her usual matter-of-fact tone, "I noticed you haven't been keeping up with the laundry lately. I went ahead and took care of it this time, but it's important to stay on top of things." Emily clenched her jaw, gripping the dish towel tightly. I appreciate the help, Alice, but I don't need reminders about taking care of my own house, she replied, barely containing her frustration. Alice raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Emily's attempt at setting boundaries. I'm only trying to keep things running smoothly, dear. With everyone here, we all need to contribute. The implication hit Emily hard, as if her efforts to maintain the household were somehow insufficient in Alice's eyes. And, just as she was about to respond, Mike walked in, seemingly oblivious to the tension. What's going on here? He asked, sensing the strain but not understanding the source. Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and pent-up hurt. Mike, I can't keep doing this. Your mom and Molly have taken over every part of this house. I don't feel respected, and it's exhausting living like this every day. Mike's expression hardened, his tone defensive. Emily, they're family. They're only here to help us, and they've sacrificed a lot to make our lives easier. Can't you just appreciate that? She felt her patience snap. Help us? Mike, they've done nothing but disrupt our lives. I feel like a stranger here. Every time I try to make this work, I'm dismissed. I can't keep sacrificing my peace just to keep everyone else comfortable. But Mike shook his head, clearly siding with his family over her yet again. You're being dramatic, Emily. This is temporary, and I don't see why you can't just go along with it for now. In that moment, Emily saw with painful clarity that Mike would never choose her needs over the comfort of his family. She had held on to the hope that he would eventually understand, that he would prioritize their marriage over the expectations of his mother and sister. But as he stood there, dismissing her pain and defending them, Emily knew he'd made his choice. Feeling an intense wave of clarity, she straightened up, her voice calm but resolute. If you can't see what this is doing to us, Mike, then maybe it's time I start looking out for myself. I won't keep living in a house where my voice doesn't matter. Mike looked taken aback, perhaps realizing for the first time how serious she was. Emily, are you really going to throw all of this away? Over what? A few disagreements? But Emily's resolve had solidified. I'm not throwing anything away, Mike. I'm choosing peace and respect, things that I can't find here anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her mind racing but her heart finally feeling a sense of relief. She knew there was no going back, no more attempts to fix a life that had become unbearable. For the first time, she felt the weight lift, and she understood that her next steps would be for her alone. That night, Emily began planning her exit from a home that no longer felt like hers, ready to reclaim the sense of peace and respect she had long been denied. After her breaking point with Mike, Emily knew that she couldn't continue in a household where her needs and voice were ignored. She spent the next few days in quiet reflection, moving carefully as she prepared for the life changes ahead. Mike had tried to brush off their confrontation, acting as if her words had simply been an outburst, a temporary frustration that would fade. But Emily knew that something had shifted within her for good. Determined to take her next steps thoughtfully, Emily began organizing her belongings and preparing for a life outside the home. She gathered important documents, secured her personal finances, and confided in her closest friends, who offered her both their encouragement and practical support. Emily's friends had watched her struggles over the months, and they reminded her of her strength, reinforcing her decision to pursue a healthier, more fulfilling life on her own terms. Her friends suggested she reach out to a lawyer, so Emily made a quiet appointment to discuss her options for separating from Mike and potentially dividing their assets. She was ready to leave, but she wanted to be sure she handled the process with clarity and control. At home, Emily started distancing herself from the household routines. She stopped trying to keep up with Alice's rules and let Molly's mess remain untouched. Instead of feeling obligated to manage the chaos, she began focusing on her own needs, investing her time in work projects and spending evenings out with friends. The subtle shift allowed her to mentally detach from the house, treating it less like a home and more like a temporary place she happened to occupy. One evening, while Mike was out with Alice and Molly, Emily took a moment to sit alone in the quiet. She looked around at the space they had once built together, filled with remnants of her efforts to create a warm and loving home. She had poured so much of herself into making this house a sanctuary, but it had transformed into a place that no longer resembled her or respected her presence. In that moment, Emily felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. She was done sacrificing her peace for a household that didn't see her. The life she had built with Mike was slipping away, and she was ready to let it go. When Mike returned later that night, Emily was calm but distant. She didn't bring up their earlier argument or attempt to reopen the conversation. Instead, she chose silence, knowing that her actions would soon speak louder than any words. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace in the decision she'd made, knowing that she was moving forward, step by step, toward a future that respected her worth. As the days passed, Emily began to take small steps in preparation for her departure. She found a modest apartment nearby and quietly signed the lease, securing a place that she could finally call her own. Though the idea of leaving brought a bittersweet feeling, it also filled her with a newfound sense of hope and freedom. Emily had quietly resolved to reclaim her life, and now, with her next steps in place, she was ready to walk toward a future built on her terms. With a quiet determination, Emily continued to lay the groundwork for her departure. She knew that each step she took brought her closer to reclaiming the peace she had lost in the home she once shared with Mike. Every evening after work, she would pack small belongings, things she cherished, like her favorite books, sentimental keepsakes, and a few pieces of art. She stored them in a small storage unit she had rented near her new apartment, knowing that when the time came, she'd be ready to leave without hesitation. Emily also met with her lawyer again, this time with a clear plan in mind. She reviewed her legal options, discussing how to handle the division of assets and the steps necessary for a clean and fair separation. Her lawyer listened with empathy, assuring her that she could move forward confidently, even if Mike was unaware of her preparations. They discussed everything she needed to do to ensure a smooth transition, protecting her finances, establishing her own bank account, and making sure she had access to all necessary documents. At home, Emily kept her distance from Mike's family. She no longer engaged in arguments with Alice, nor did she try to enforce any boundaries with Molly. Instead, she treated them with polite detachment, avoiding unnecessary conversations and interactions. She was now an observer in her own home, watching as Mike and his family carried on, completely oblivious to her decision to leave. To them, she was simply pulling back after a heated argument, a temporary phase that would pass. One evening, as Mike and his family sat around watching a movie in the living room, Emily quietly retreated to their bedroom. She took one last look around, mentally saying goodbye to the life they'd once imagined. It was a life that, for her, no longer held meaning or promise. The bond she had once shared with Mike had eroded, replaced by a painful understanding that he would never prioritize her or protect her peace. That night, Emily wrote a letter. She poured her heart into it, carefully choosing her words to explain her decision without anger or resentment. She wanted Mike to understand her perspective, to know that this wasn't just a reaction to his family's behavior, but a necessary step for her own well-being. She wrote about how she had tried, again and again, to reach him, to make him see the damage their living situation was doing to their marriage. And how, after months of feeling unheard and unvalued, she had decided to choose herself. She ended the letter with a wish for him to find happiness, a hope that he might eventually understand her choice, even if he couldn't accept it. She placed the letter in an envelope and tucked it into a drawer, ready for the day she would leave it behind as her final message. With her plan now fully in motion, Emily felt a profound sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in months, she knew she was on the path to regaining her peace and happiness. The life she was preparing to step into was one that she had shaped with intention and strength. The morning of her departure arrived quietly, almost peacefully. Emily woke up early, the weight of her decision resting gently on her shoulders. She moved through the house she had once called home with a sense of finality, collecting a few last items before she left for good. She glanced around at each room, letting herself remember the good memories, the times when she and Mike had shared dreams of a future together before it had all unraveled. With her bags packed, Emily took a deep breath and placed the letter on the kitchen counter where Mike would see it. She took one last look around, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. This was the right decision, even if it meant starting over. The home that had once symbolized her dreams now felt like a place she no longer belonged. In the letter, she had written everything she'd struggled to communicate to Mike during their time together. She explained the impact of his family's presence, how their disregard had slowly eroded her sense of peace and belonging. She recounted the many times she had tried to talk to him, to set boundaries, and to ask for his support, only to be dismissed. She wanted him to understand that her decision wasn't made lightly, that it was the result of countless days and nights spent feeling invisible in her own home. The letter read, "Mike, I know this may come as a surprise, but please believe that this decision is something I've thought about for a long time. I tried to reach you, to explain how the situation at home was affecting me. I hope that you would understand, that maybe we could find a way to create a home together where both of our voices mattered. But I can't keep sacrificing my happiness and sense of self. I can't keep living in a place where I feel like a stranger. I tried to be patient, to compromise, but each day brought more distance between us. Your loyalty to your family is something I respect, but I can't live with the reality that it comes at the cost of our marriage. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to do this. This isn't goodbye out of anger or bitterness, but out of love for myself and the life I want to live. I wish you happiness, and I hope you find a path that brings you peace. Emily." After leaving the letter in place, Emily gathered her things and walked out the door, closing it softly behind her. She made her way to her car, feeling the first breath of freedom as she stepped out of the home she had felt trapped in for so long. She drove away without looking back, focused only on the road ahead. As she settled into her new apartment, a quiet space filled with light and the absence of conflict, Emily felt a wave of relief. This was her fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life on her terms, free from the constant compromises she had been forced to make. She spent the evening unpacking and arranging her things, finding comfort in the simplicity of her new surroundings. That night, Emily sat by the window, sipping a cup of tea and feeling the weight of her past slowly lift. She was finally in a place that respected her, that reflected her values, her needs, and her independence. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that she would write entirely for herself. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a quiet, enduring sense of peace. In her new apartment, Emily settled into a life that was entirely her own. The small, sunlit space reflected the simplicity and calm she had craved for so long. She decorated the rooms with her favorite colors, hung up cherished artwork, and carefully placed plants by the windows that filled her home with warmth. Every detail, every choice, was hers alone, a reminder of the independence she had regained. At first, the adjustment felt surreal. For so long, Emily had existed in a constant state of stress, anticipating every shift and conflict in a home where her boundaries were ignored. Now, the quiet of her new place felt like a gift. There were no unsolicited opinions from Alice, no messes from Molly, and no need to defend her choices to anyone. She was free to relax, unwind, and create a life that reflected her values. Emily began reconnecting with old friends, who welcomed her back into their lives with open arms. She shared parts of her story with them, finding solace in their support and encouragement. Some friends had watched her struggles over the years, and they were relieved to see her finally prioritizing her own happiness. Her evenings were now spent enjoying casual dinners, movie nights, and meaningful conversations, simple pleasures that reminded her of the joy she had been missing. At work, Emily threw herself into new projects, impressing her colleagues and her boss with her dedication and renewed focus. The more she invested in her career, the more she felt her confidence grow. Her boss, noticing her hard work and resilience, offered her a promotion that came with more responsibility and a well-deserved salary increase. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, a validation that she had found success on her own terms. Reflecting on her journey, Emily saw that leaving her marriage had allowed her to reclaim a version of herself that she thought she'd lost. She was no longer defined by the compromises she'd made or the conflicts she'd endured. Instead, she was a woman with a clear sense of purpose, driven by her own dreams and values. One weekend, as she tidied up her apartment, Emily came across a small memento, a photo of her and Mike from happier times. She looked at it for a moment, feeling a bittersweet pang of nostalgia, but she placed it back in a drawer. Her past with Mike was something she would carry with her, but it no longer held power over her. She was free, not just from him and his family, but from the life that had made her feel invisible. Now, every morning, Emily woke up knowing that her home was a sanctuary. Her days were filled with peace, her nights with rest. And as she stepped further into this new chapter, she understood that her journey had led her to a place of strength and self-respect. She had regained control, not just over her environment, but over her life. With her new life taking shape, Emily embraced the peace and purpose she had longed for. The journey had been difficult, but each challenge had brought her closer to a life rooted in her own values. She was no longer defined by the expectations of others or weighed down by the compromises she'd once made. Instead, she was discovering a new kind of happiness, one that came from within. One Saturday morning, as sunlight filled her apartment, Emily took a moment to reflect. She thought back to the day she had left the house she and Mike had shared, a day that once felt like the end of everything. Now, it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. She had built a world that was entirely her own, a world filled with meaningful connections, professional fulfillment, and a deep sense of self-respect. The friends she had reconnected with became an integral part of her new life, surrounding her with laughter and genuine support. Emily joined a book club and began exploring hobbies she had once loved but set aside, like photography, which allowed her to see beauty in the details of her everyday life. Weekends were spent on hikes or road trips with friends, capturing snapshots of the world as she reclaimed her sense of adventure and curiosity. At work, her career flourished. The promotion had come with new challenges, but each step in her professional journey brought her a renewed sense of purpose. Emily found herself thriving, driven not by anyone's expectations, but by her own determination to succeed. Her colleagues admired her resilience and dedication, often coming to her for guidance and encouragement. In time, Emily became known as someone who could navigate even the toughest situations with grace and integrity. One evening, after returning from a dinner with friends, Emily sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about how far she had come, from feeling trapped and invisible in a life that wasn't hers to building a life that reflected her true self. She was grateful for her journey, even the painful moments, because they had taught her the importance of self-respect, boundaries, and resilience. As she sat in the quiet of her apartment, she realized that she no longer felt the weight of her past. The sadness and frustration had been replaced by pride and hope. She had taken a difficult path, but it had led her to a place of fulfillment and peace. Her life was now a reflection of the strength she had found within herself. Emily closed her eyes, breathing in the calm that surrounded her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew she was ready for it. Whatever came next, she was confident she would face it with the same courage that had brought her here. She had learned that true happiness wasn't about fulfilling someone else's expectations, it was about honoring her own dreams and living a life that brought her joy. With a quiet smile, Emily opened her eyes and raised her glass to the new chapter ahead. She was finally home.